This is part of a studio class in how to develop and design affordable housing, and particularly with an emphasis on a component for homeless families or individuals. And we have an esteemed jury that will be judging the student competitions starting at 2 o'clock. But we thought we would start, because I will say this, David, Daniel, and I, so David Baker, Daniel Simons, and myself are the instructors for this class, and we have learned so much from the students as well as from all the different folks we have brought in to work with the students on these projects. And we thought that, you know, starting out with some of that conversation, particularly around the very dire homeless situation we have in the Bay Area and throughout the country, would be a good way to kick off the student presentations to come. And we have a architectural alumni of the College of Environmental Design, the architecture school, James Boyce, to thank for this entire effort, the studio class, as well as this symposium. And here representing the James Boyce estate, and there's a biography in your program, but I'd like to just introduce Lori Ocam. I think that's how you say your name. Can you stand and just be acknowledged for, thank you so much for the support for this effort. It has been a truly remarkable experience for me, and I hope and believe for all the students who are anxious to get on with their presentations this afternoon, as you can imagine. But we've pulled together just a few of our jury members to have a bit of a conversation about homelessness, and I will say I titled this symposium panel, what did I title it? We can do this, right? We can do this. Oh, yeah, we can do this. And one of my fellow panelists called me up and said, that's audacious for you to suggest we can do this. And I guess I would say, I said that because we have to do this, right? We are clearly in a crisis situation, and there is just a moral obligation in our society to figure out how we put the brain power and resources behind solving this problem. And so I am delighted to have some folks who have been on the front lines of working this issue for some period of time. And we're going to start out with just having each one of the panelists talk about, maybe run through some slides or other presentations on the work they've been doing that they believe has been making a difference. And we will get to what we're still grappling with and the struggles and the innovations that we still need to get to. But let's start with, we have made some progress and we are doing some good things, so I'd really like to start with that. And up first we have Angie Brooks, who is a remarkable architect from Southern California, and we used a number of her developments, frankly, in our precedent-setting work at the beginning of the studio class, and all the students were just awed by your tremendous work, Angie. So could you kick us off?
Thank you. Certainly. I'm going to follow my notes because I have 10 minutes, and that's the only way I'm going to be able to do this. But I've been a practicing architect in Los Angeles for 30 years, and I'm going to show you 3 projects that we've completed for previously homeless people. And I think I have a somewhat unique perspective because one of my first jobs after graduating from SCIARC was to work for a nonprofit housing developer. Because I actually wanted to make cities better, I didn't want to just design buildings. I think our ability to house people is directly tied to our ability to build smart. So for instance, codes, our policies, our parking minimums, public transit, mixed-use construction, increased density, co-housing, micro-units, and affordability. I think we need to be more creative in the housing options that we provide for people in this country. And this is an image from a nonprofit that I co-founded almost 20 years ago to attempt to do some of this in Los Angeles where we didn't see policymakers actually doing it. When we did this, people had 2 options. You could live in an apartment, rent an apartment, or you could own a house, and that was really it. This project is in downtown Santa Monica, and it's called Step Up on 5th. It's 46 studio apartments for previously homeless people with mental disabilities. And I always put the density on my images, and I know you use population. I use unit density to show that the density of this building is almost as high as Manhattan in a 5-story building. And that's because the units are very small. They're about 245 square feet. In Los Angeles, we constantly find ourselves fighting against our height restrictions. So this building is actually shorter than it could be by right, because the client didn't want to go into a discretionary review where it would be public. Because people in LA County hate 2 things. They hate density and they hate height. And it's on an empty parking lot site. About half of our projects actually were built as infill projects on parking lots. It's residential above public spaces which house an art gallery. The art program for Step Up on 2nd is a part of the healing process for people dealing with mental disabilities. 2 blocks away from this building is their main Step Up on 2nd building, which has a community kitchen where they have a job training program so people can walk from both projects. And projects of this type generally suffer from a lack of depth, I think. There's just a very small facade for what's essentially a very large project. So we try to create depth spatially and through the use of materials. And basically the diagram is 1 bar connected by 3 boxes with exterior walkways. There are 2 very small courtyards. Spatially, all of the units have the same plan. We had to provide parking for people who don't own cars, but that's another story. At a cost, I could have built another building for the cost of the parking that we had to provide for this building. The units are really small, 240 square feet. And if you think about going from a sidewalk to an apartment, for some people that's a very big step. One of the tenants in this building actually slept on the floor of his apartment for a year before he could actually sleep in his bed. We have cross ventilation in all the units and Murphy beds that flip out of the wall as a way to deal with some of the smaller interior spaces. This project is both permanent housing for people and transitional housing for people. It's a step up for them to get into something else. The plan is basically the letter E. Like a lot of our buildings that are naturally ventilated, they're alphabet letters. 2 large common rooms, kitchens on every other floor, and everyone circulates around walkways. And we always tuck the elevator out of the way so that people can circulate on what basically is an exterior stair. So rather than kind of ignoring the exterior stair, we try to make it an element in the space so that people actually circulate through the space. This is an image of the 2 main kitchens. People don't have full kitchens in their units, they're just smaller kitchenettes, and so it's a way to encourage socialization. This project is in Venice. It's called Gateway Apartments. It's 4 stories, 21 1-bedroom units for previously homeless people. LA County ranks 2nd for the largest homeless population behind New York, and 10% of our homeless people are veterans. So this project and the next one are also for veterans. And this was conceived the same way, 2 bar buildings with a courtyard in the middle on a very tiny 80-foot wide lot with community spaces on the ground floor and parking tucked behind. And because the lot was so small, we had to put all the open space on the roof. So this is a picture of our roof open space where they have a community garden program. We have found that in LA, it's actually cheaper to house people than to leave them on the street. We spend an average of $35,000 a year in medical emergency mental health services for each person, and if you incarcerate that person, it's $46,000 a year. So for $10,000 a year, you can help that person obtain housing, food, job training, and support services. And while California has the nation's largest population, I'm sure all of you guys know this from your research, California's rate which is 34 homeless residents per 10,000 people, is twice the national average. LA County has 55,000 homeless people homeless on a given night, and that's a lot more than the population of West Hollywood, which is 35,000 people. And this is from my neighborhood where I live in Venice, a Vietnam veteran living in a tunnel beneath one of the public parking lots. In my neighborhood, the average price for a 2-bedroom apartment is $4,900 a month, and the vacancy rate in the LA metro area is 2.9%. So we have a big problem. Our city council has already created tent camps on empty city parking lots as a way to get people off of the street. And good news is that our voters in 2016 approved ballot measures by a landslide, 70%, to fund housing and support services for the homeless, and we voted to increase our sales tax by 0.5 cent to expand public transit. So people want solutions. This project is called The Six, and it's the most recent one that we just finished. It is for homeless veterans. It's near downtown LA, and it's for the Skid Row Housing Trust. And the party is the same as the others, with a main courtyard and then housing in 2 bars, which are actually connected at the 5th floor. All the units have cross ventilation, natural cross ventilation. There's solar panels on the roof. But the courtyard is raised up a floor because the people who live here wanted to be protected from the street. They previously lived on the street. They wanted to have a visual connection but be physically separate from it. So we had design meetings with the homeless people who were on the building committee to actually design this building. This is just an image of the main courtyard with the rec room and the sliding doors here. Everyone circulates through the public space, but you have choices to be either social or to go to the roof and have a more quiet space. The rec room has a community kitchen, a television, open on the 2nd floor. And the ground floor has support services and a computer lab. And this is the roof. These forms on the roof actually hide the kitchen exhausts that have to come through. Great views of downtown LA. The tenants really love coming up here, a quiet space for them to hang out. And when you look at the interior of units, I really believe that there's a direct correlation between ceiling height, height of a window, and amount of natural light that you get in the space. So most of these studio apartments are 350 square feet. On the right are 2 tenants that were featured in LA's I Look Up Film Challenge last year, which actually ended up winning the grand prize. The film was about homelessness, and the filmmaker decided to create the film for Mike Alvidrez, who's the executive director of the Skid Row Housing Trust, and he interviewed several architects, and I'm gonna play that for you right now.
We've become a culture that ignores people and looks the other way. Our homeless problem, especially in Los Angeles, is so large now that it's almost untenable.
Los Angeles has the highest number of unsheltered people anywhere in the country, and clearly you can see that in Skid Row.
There's a lot of suffering that goes on. If you're not ready to live in the streets, it gets pretty profound.
For those individuals who have been largely isolated and alone, beginning to try to build a sense of community is one of the essential goals.
Skid Row Housing Trust is a nonprofit organization. We have a portfolio of 26 permanent supportive housing properties, mostly here in downtown Los Angeles, where we house some of the most vulnerable men and women who've experienced homelessness. I think what makes us really stand out is our focus on design.
All of the projects that we've done with the Housing Trust looks at trying to create a type of semi-public social space within the building. The Star Apartments, from the beginning, meant to be as forward-thinking as possible.
A very highly visible example of what solutions to homelessness can look like.
I've known Mike for a long time, and this is really our first collaboration. The name of this project is The Six that we did for Mike, and that means that, in military terms, it means I've got your back. And really, Mike is the 6 for homeless people.
I think I was one of the first people who moved, who had keys, and I thought I was dreaming. And I came in and looked, it was empty. I was like, whose house is this? They said, yours. I got a little radio, a microwave, a crock pot. What more can you ask for?
They have everything contained in their own unit, but then we have multiple groups, and some groups are provided by us, the RSCs, and some groups we have outside people come in.
What makes good design is not what something looks like, but what it is like, meaning how you experience it.
We have a ceramic group, garden group, yoga, the music jam, as you see. You know, I told you I was run over by a small pickup truck riding my bike. Well, things like these events, they help you recover. It took my breath away because I've been suffering for a number of years. Suffering for years. And what are you gonna expect, you know?
Breaking stereotypes of the homeless goes back to design. It says something. It says we care about you.
It's really a matter of educating the community, getting community support so that people kind of understand this is going to actually be a community asset.
We are in actually the base of one of our 26 properties of the New Pershing, and we use it as our monthly concert event, Trust and Sound.
Design definitely can empower individual. If you ask Mike, he'll tell you that good design is part of the healing.
A little bit like Frank Sinatra, if you can do it here, you can do it anywhere. No one has a bigger homeless crisis than we do here in Skid Row.
I think it's absolutely a replicable model. All you need is the will to do it.
These are our cities. Whatever we make here, whatever buildings we build here, they're part of the larger fabric that defines our cities.
Okay, thank you.
Wow, thank you. Angie, thank you. That was very inspiring and lots more to talk about as we go on here. I do want to shift to Brad Woodland, who is Executive Vice President of Bridge Housing Corporation, and I was telling a story earlier, which I won't repeat, that I hired Brad and worked for many years with him, and one of the most, I don't know what to say, one of the greatest developers, I think, of all times in terms of his sensibilities on a variety of issues, but both architecturally and design-wise as well as programmatically. And I think, Brad, you can talk a little bit about Bridge Housing's evolution in serving the homeless population in your remarks.
Great. Thanks, Carol. And welcome, everyone. As Carol mentioned, I've been at Bridge for a few years, about 24, and I guess 24 and a half ago, I was probably sitting in a room like this, right where you are, wondering where I was going to work. But I, like you, had a passion for this kind of work, and that's, taken me on an incredible journey within the company. And so today, with limited time, I want to talk a little bit about Bridge's evolution. When I got there, Bridge was really a housing production machine. That's kind of what Don and Carol and others had got us on the path toward. We had a mission statement that was quality, quantity, and affordability, and quantity was a big part of what we were doing. We were not in the services business. We were not in the serving formerly homeless, or what we would generically call now permanent supportive housing. And so I want to walk through some projects where we as a company have come to learn a little bit more about how to produce this housing and kind of where we are today as we've responded. So beginning, this is a shot of the Trans Bay neighborhood in San Francisco, former redevelopment agency neighborhood. They had a large inclusionary requirement as a result, and they also wanted to serve formerly homeless. So San Francisco, in their wisdom, kind of decided that although there'd be a lot of affordable housing built on individual blocks within Trans Bay, they wanted to serve the homeless in a kind of a self-contained or at least efficient way. So the response was this little red box here that we call Renee Cazenave, who was a housing and homeless advocate in San Francisco. This was a 50-50 partnership with CHP, Community Housing Partnership, and we intended from the very beginning to use our balance sheet and use our development expertise in San Francisco to build this building. And at 8609, many of you know this is a sort of milestone within tax credit development, where your investor gets a certificate that says, okay, all the right people live here, you followed all the rules. At 8609, Bridge was going to exit the partnership. It was simply a build to suit and an opportunity for us to learn more about this housing. This was all studios and ones, and like Angela's work, I think we strive at Bridge and have forever to kind of exceed people's expectations on the built product. But buildings like this are not just about how they feel and the architecture, but what Rick Holliday calls the software. You know, we need a really strong service provider when we're in this business, and Community Housing Partnership has turned out to be everything we expected. Here's the finished product. We're looking at some retail on the ground floor, very interesting. Right away we had like kind of high-end chocolatier, you know, in the basement of a building with 120 formerly homeless folks. It was a little surprising and uplifting, frankly. I'm not sure you can all see this, so I'll just go by colors. One of the themes that you'll see in some of these buildings I'm working on or that I'm showing today, is how do you provide services in a way that provides privacy for those residents that are, you know, meeting with counselors or care providers while providing privacy, but also some dignity and hopefully a slightly uplifting experience. And I think this idea of a main street, this yellow bar through the middle, is kind of our response. In the blue to the upper side of the slide to that is really the counseling suites. To the far side, the lighter blue is that retail we just discussed. On the far left is the entry, and the entry experience is pretty unique. In buildings that have a permanent supportive housing component, we end up having a 24-hour front desk. You could call it a concierge or security or reception, but that's another design element that's really important. And I'll talk a little bit more about the first time I heard about this notion later in this. But this main street, as you'll see, kind of opens. Here's the reception. Here's what you see as you enter on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side is a slide that shows kind of a courtyard space to the right, and on the left is where those suites are for services. We did exit that building at 8609. Community Housing Partnership owns the building, manages the building, and by all accounts, pretty successful within the Trans Bay District, which has just exploded since that project was built. Moving south to San Diego, this was a 250-unit project that we won the rights to develop with the former redevelopment agency in San Diego. And they had a very specific requirement for us, and this was a big move for Bridge to sort of venture into a building that we were going to own and manage that had a very complicated population. 25 units that were a response to MHSA, the Mental Health Services Act, a program that used to exist or kind of exists or is being transformed in California right now. And when CCDC said, we want you to put a population of mentally ill folks in with families, I remember having a conversation. I said, well, who's ever done that? This is maybe 10 years ago. That's how far we've kind of come. Apparently they'd heard that from several other developers, so along with a national nonprofit, they actually took us back to New York, and we got to look at what Common Ground was doing. This is a large nonprofit in the city that was in fact doing this. And we got to talk to some residents, we got to talk to folks that were formerly homeless, we got to talk to families. And to this entrance experience and the concierge, both the formerly homeless guys that we talked to said, we love having security out there. I've just left the street. I don't want all of those people that were kind of keeping me there or helping me stay there. I don't want them coming to this building. I'm trying to move up and out. And then the families, of course, said, it's helpful for us to know. We've got kids running in the hallways. We've got these folks that are mentally ill. They didn't have any of the prejudices that I came to this thing with. So that was an important moment, and I think I came back and convinced Carol and Lydia that we should give this a try. This was also unique in that, this was sort of a 4% and 9% tax credit project kind of stacked on top of each other. And I know there are some proposals here today that are utilizing a similar response. This is a LEED Platinum building. We have a bunch of 250 square foot, what the city calls living units. And like Angela, as I'll show you here on the bottom left, this is the unit, and there's 10 feet floor to floor with a lot of glass. In San Diego, you can kind of get away with that. We've also got some shading on the building, but when I walk in there, it feels like an upscale hotel room. What a great response, in my opinion, to this population that maybe is coming to housing as we saw in the video, and this is a new experience, or they're re-experiencing how to become independent again. There's the front desk experience as you walk in on the upper left, and on the right side, we didn't have a Main Street theme in this building because it's so vertical and the site is so small, but what you're seeing is some of these counseling suites that open onto outdoor courtyard spaces on a 5th floor plinth. So once again, we're trying to deliver this complicated and private experience of having this service delivery within the building, but making it a positive experience all the way around, architecturally and spatially. I'm going to shift gears back to Mission Bay and where Bridge is today. It's a relatively new project that we were selected. This is 140 studio units, all formerly homeless, a couple blocks from AT&T Park. A couple of concepts here that where Bridge is bringing some of its experience. We're building this building as modular. Not a small feat in San Francisco politically, but David and I, frankly, and I've talked to David about this, we helped move the needle. We threw ourselves on a sword in a prior interview, pitched a modular project, and we were in the middle of the interview, and a fellow looked across the table, he says, "We're not ready for modular." And 3 months later, the city issued an RFP and said, "We want you to show modular." And we got a rare phone call, which you never get, which is someone from the city saying, "You guys helped move the needle." So we didn't like losing that opportunity, but we did manage to get it the next time around. So the concepts here are there's a bunch of different kinds of spaces. Private space, obviously, in the units themselves. There's kind of shared public open space in the courtyard. And then at the bottom of the slide is a public way that we abut another parcel, and we're completely surrounded by, well, on one side we got a police station, but everywhere else are very high-end condos. And people were quite concerned in the neighborhood about how we were going to interface, but only in a way that was safe and comfortable for everybody. This, I said, is modular. This is just a simple diagram showing what these modular units kind of look like when you lay out the modular grid on top of a design. This was all about simplicity, building a 4-story on-grade wood building in San Francisco. Unfortunately, we have to pound piles down a couple hundred feet just because we're in Mission Bay and because there's a certain building that's leaning. We're going to spend a lot of money, like you did on parking, on what probably structurally isn't actually required, but politically we absolutely have to do it. Again, simple layout, stack flats, double loaded corridor, 2 unit types. And then here's the Main Street idea again in this building, in that orange stripe. You see service suites on the left, the courtyard on below across that Main Street. There are management offices and other community facilities within the building, whether it's laundry or other lounge areas. And then, of course, the more traditional community rooms and things that we see in all of our buildings. This is a building, again, with CHP. We have a very strong service provider partner. This one we're going to stay in and we're going to continue to own with them. So again, kind of the evolution at Bridge of our thinking. We're turning this big organization toward the problem that Skid Row Housing Trust and others have been on for a long time. And we're trying to bring our expertise and our production mindset to this in a sensitive way, but it really touches the whole organization, and it's been an education for us, the staff, our board, and senior leadership. Thank you.
Great.
Oh yes, thank you.
Thanks, Brad. We're going to hear now from David Baker, who I know the students have probably feel like they've already heard too much from. Just kidding, David. Already I feel like the good food for thought here for the rest of our conversation. So David, give us a couple minutes on your thoughts.
So we do a lot of housing, and I'm starting with this slide simply because this is two projects which are very similar. They have 325 square foot units. On the left is a micro unit condos selling for $1,500 to $2,000 per square foot, with one of the 10th best donut in the country being made underneath it. And on the right is the same unit with not as nice a refrigerator or cabinets, which is housing formerly homeless, with CHP owning this building. And actually, what's interesting, a very nice pizzeria with beer and wine on tap, which is also a formerly homeless restaurant training work program. So, so we do this housing. Some of it is in the form of inclusionary. So this is down at the bottom there. You can see it's a very long building, which that building is big enough to have 90 affordable units in it. This included a park with a whole neighborhood process, and dog parks we're a city of dog owners. And so, there's the very happy dogs. And then this is a big enough project so it has two buildings with all kinds of stuff on the bottom. Art studios, flexible live work, retail. And then there's the very interesting key site here with those zigzags. This is actually taken sort of underneath the freeway so that it looks to the downtown. Then I think more important is, to my mind, or more critical, is the special needs housing. I mean, I think that's one of the things that we haven't built enough housing. And so that puts pressure on people, because basically whenever you have a huge boom, people work for architecture firms start renting studios in the Tenderloin. And there's whoever was living there before, they go somewhere else, and I think often it's the streets. So there's a lot of pressure that's put on by not building enough market rate housing. But the special needs housing, this is senior housing for formerly homeless, with a 30% formerly homeless senior component in Oakland. And there's the kind of the big look of the building, which I think is really important. As architects, I think Angie and I share the desire to do really good architecture in this realm. And I think that it is important, and it does empower and honor people and gives them dignity and and it really works. I mean, and I think they get less trash, they get less graffiti. So it really is something. It's hard to really quantify and put a dollar figure on it. It's more of an anecdotal thing. So, but this is the entry, and then there's stoops. This is a couple residents actually talking to each other. So there's a real connection with the neighborhood. There's security. Here's the courtyard, which opens to the street. And then we discover, every time we do one of these things, we discover, and we thought that mahjong was really a big deal in a lot of projects we did. So we had these mahjong spaces. Turns out ping pong is the thing that's really popular here. There's a lot of senior Asian folks who are really good ping pong players. Anyway, so then another project, this is an interesting one with a for-profit developer related, but doing workforce housing with no actual homeless component, but it's lower income workforce. This is in Mission Bay. It's has this iconic element that actually those things that look like alien landing structure is there's a timber bamboo there, and those are rings. And anybody who has timber bamboo knows that you really want to have rings around it because it kind of blows flat with the ground during storms. This is even in San Francisco, you can do exterior circulation. And actually, it's really nice. It's funny. It's always a big push to do it. This building really benefits from it. So that's the mail room opening up to the courtyard. Here's the Smurf turf. That's the tot lot. One of the things. There's a lot actually in homeless buildings. You get a lot of kids because there's a lot of single parent families that are living on the streets. I'm just going to finish up with industrial housing. We're involved with Factory OS, and on this coming wave of not building things little stick by stick out on the site. And that interview was really terrible. I think he actually said, we will never build a modular building in San Francisco. It was something along those lines. It was really, they just practically threw us out, you know. But this is one that's we're just finishing up now, so that, you know, that's the digital rendering above, and there's the building below. This is about to start construction by West Oakland Park. But what's really interesting, I think one of the real areas where we could really make a dent with industrial housing is kind of simplifying this process and not reinventing the wheel every time. So we're actually taking these units and, you know, we're like, well, maybe we'll make the units 13 foot 6 wide. And we're kind of, no, let's make them 12 foot 7. That works. We don't have to redesign it. You see all that, those dotted lines and everything. This is kind of a master's thesis in rule following. As you know, it's not really creative, so I don't think you want to do it over and over again, which we do. But anyway, so we're assembling these. We're working with a nonprofit, I guess, an incubator or fund, to do these units in San Francisco, and to do stuff that's just really simple. You know, applying the KISS principle, and still do buildings that are nice, but, you know, really put the production and forward. This is one in San Jose, same type of unit. So, and you can see there's the brown shingle there. Though in San Jose we have parking, which is it's terrible. It's terrible to have to put parking in these things. So anyway, thank you very much, and we'll go to Tamika.
Thanks, David. So I'm going to ask Tamika to bring us home here. Tamika has been on all sides, all different roles, from working for Tenderloin Neighborhood Development Corporation to Mayor Libby Schaaf's chief of staff, to working on Hope SF in San Francisco, and now runs Hamilton Families, which serves homeless families. So it would be great, maybe we should have started with you actually talking about individuals and families and what you're doing, but I'm gonna let you take it away.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's been really great to actually situate this conversation in the built environment. I think it's a really important intersection of how we're addressing homelessness in the region. And I think what I've found being at Hamilton is that there's an interesting cultural disconnect between the housers and developers and the service providers and the homelessness advocates who are working to address the issues. And so I think it's really amazing to be with you all, to really be talking about what we all can do to address the complicated challenges around homelessness. And so one of the pieces that I find, and we're starting this part of our talk about what's working, so I'll start there. One of the things that has been most profound to me is that homelessness is actually solvable, particularly for families. And I think it's really challenging when you see what Los Angeles is experiencing, communities all across the country who are experiencing increases in homelessness. And in San Francisco, it's been a perennial issue for us for a long time, and feeling hopeless, and that we don't have solutions that work, and we aren't able to scale interventions that work. And I want to just be very clear that that's actually not true. I think that we have to be really vigilant about investing in solutions that work and not being distracted because people are upset that it is one of the most dehumanizing experiences for citizens in our city to be living on our streets. And we should not be comfortable with that. We should continue to have a visceral reaction around that, whatever it comes up for you. And I think that as we move through our lives and we're all busy trying to do what we can to be good citizens, it's really important to recognize that it's not acceptable what's happening in our country. This crisis is a rash of failed public systems that I think we really have to be looking at. What is the intersection of the policy domains that is producing an increase in homelessness across our country? And so those are some of the things that we think about in terms of the families that we serve. We provide emergency housing services for families. We have the largest family shelter in the city that we operate. We have transitional housing support for families. And then we have a rental subsidy program that we provide short-term rental subsidies for families in the private market. So we have a real estate department that's a part of our organization that works with landlords in the private market and encourages them to work with families and to recognize that homelessness is actually not an identity. It is a circumstance. And if we can figure out how to challenge societal's imposition of that as that is who the person is, we can break down some of those barriers and recognize that, in fact, homelessness is not monolithic. When we talk about what are the factors that are driving people to homelessness, in Alameda County, for example, we just did the point in time count, which is a way in which HUD, I see Ophelia here in the front row, does a biannual count of individuals and people experiencing homelessness one night in January. There's a lot of critique about whether or not how effective that count is, but Alameda County actually saw almost a 50% increase in their homeless population over that 2-year period. The city of Oakland saw an increase of 25%. And what was profound to me about those numbers was that individuals who reported being homeless were not homeless for more than a year. So this was all very new, economically driven circumstances that drove a lot of people into homelessness in Alameda County, which again, if we're looking at the intersectionality between the other policy domains that affect folks' housing stability, we're talking about job loss. We're talking about domestic violence situations that are coming up for families. We're talking about opportunities where income inequality, 50% of the families that we serve have jobs. So we're not talking about people who are not trying to do what they're told in terms of the societal norms that have been set for them. And yet still they are unable to be competitive in this housing market that, in fact, when you start subsidizing households who are making $100,000 a year, there is a fundamental problem with the market forces not actually doing what they're supposed to be doing. So I think one of the things that we have learned is partnerships is the way that this is going to happen. We have been able to engage private philanthropy and helping us innovate in solutions that we know work. We can use private dollars to scale and pilot and iterate on opportunities that we think families need to take advantage of. One of the challenges that we're grappling with as an agency right now is that families who have typically had very strong social connections in San Francisco for forever, that's where they're from, they are multi-generational families who have lived in San Francisco, are now having to find affordable housing options as far as Sacramento, Stockton, and further outside of the Bay Area. And so our service model has really been predicated on an empowerment model. We support families to self-actualize, to figure out how they can activate their own personal resources. What do they want for themselves and for their kids? And we guide them and coach them, but we aren't their partner, right? We don't see ourselves as an ongoing influence in a family's life, which is why we call them participants. They are participating in the relationship with my staff at Hamilton. And yet, as they make these hard choices to leave their support networks, which we know, any of you, raise your hand if you've ever moved from your hometown to a new place. Just, right? And how important it was to have a social network to the place you were going, whether or not it was your job or your family or your community. Many of the families that we're serving are having to make the really difficult choice of having a home for their children and going to a place where they know no one. They don't know how to get to the school. They don't know how to find employment that's going to sustain their lifestyle. And so those are some of the challenges that we're grappling with and trying to evolve our service model to be more responsive to helping families once they're relocating in outlying communities. How do we create the conditions for families to thrive and be self-sufficient? And partnerships are allowing us to do that. One of the other things that we see works really well is these temporary rental subsidies. Most families and people, frankly, this also applies to youth who are experiencing homelessness, really sometimes just need, money for utilities. If I'm sleeping on David's couch, most families in the Bay Area are not unsheltered. Only 4% of our families are unsheltered. So most of them are living doubled and tripled up, or in their cars, or in transitional housing or shelters. And if David and I are cool and it's a safe place for that family to live there, I want to be able to give David some money toward the rent. So having flexibility in resources allows us to provide families with those dollars. That is a part of our prevention strategy. One of the best ways to end homelessness is to prevent it in the first place. And we need to really be thinking about how we invest in prevention and how we think about leveraging private and public partnerships to broaden the resources that are available for our prevention interventions. And then the last thing I'd say is, subsidies across the country, we call them rapid rehousing, which is a housing first model, which Hamilton Families actually pioneered about 15 years ago. And the premise of that model was to say, for a long time, I'm a social worker by training, I've worked with tons of different populations over the last 25 years. And for a long time, we were like, okay, if you have a substance use issue, we're gonna treat your substance use issue so that you can get ready to be housed, right? We're going to make sure that whatever challenges that you're contending with, we're gonna support those and then find you housing. And what we started to do was flip that on its head. The first disruption to a housing crisis is a home. It is a necessary disruption, but it is not sufficient to permanently end the cycle of homelessness that families and people experience. So we started to find housing for folks first, and then we started to provide services and case management to those individuals and families so that they can stay housed. And so that's really sort of the equation that we talk about, which is all of the work that my colleagues here are doing and that you all are thinking about is key, but that's only part of the solution if we're really going to make sure that in the world of families experiencing homelessness, children who experience homelessness for more than 2 years are 7 times more likely to experience homelessness as adults. So we have an imperative. There is a clock that's ticking. 1 in 25 students in the San Francisco Unified School District are experiencing homelessness. So partnering with the school district and figuring out innovative partnerships that allow us to be much more responsive and deepening our impact on the solutions that work have really helped us see some successes. And I'm encouraged that we're having the sort of polarity of conversation and diving into these issues because it requires a much more complex approach to a very complex problem.
Thank you. And thank you all for the hard work you're doing on this topic. So let's keep diving in. We've heard some really positive successes and solutions. And several of them, in my mind, bring up some challenges that we continue to grapple with. And one that you touched on, really, Tamika, throughout your comments that I want to go back to, which is this issue of homelessness is not, the identity, and there is not one identity for a homeless person. There are a whole variety of different populations and different circumstances that generate the homelessness. So how, when you are looking at a built environment solution, which is not the only solution, but when we're actually talking about building buildings, how do we deal with some of the issues that I feel like I heard both from Angie, David, and Brad about either whether we're mixing populations of homeless individuals, different types of I hate to use that word, but right? So transitional age youth, veterans, mixing different populations, mixing homeless individuals with either market rate market rate residents or other affordable housing residents. This is something that the students, and you'll see in there, or you've gotten their proposals, but you will see, I think, struggled with mightily, wanting to, have the mix, but then, financing sources, et cetera, not necessarily supporting that. And then also just, is that ultimately the right thing? Does it work? So how much do we mix, number one? Number two, is there, I guess, Celadon on the at least list of built projects. It's probably the most number of units, not all serving homeless individuals, but just talk about challenges of, is there a concentration issue? I noticed in the video that, Skid Row Housing Trust properties are all in a very, very concentrated area. So talk about concentration either in a building or in a neighborhood, and this mix of populations. I know that's like 10,000 questions in one, but they're all interrelated, and I think everybody struggles with it. So I'm just going to open it up. Who wants to jump in? Okay, Angie.
So Skid Row in LA was coined Skid Row because homeless people were living there a long time ago and no one was doing anything about it. And so an architect who founded a nonprofit called the Community Design Center coined it Skid Row and was able to get funding for people to get housed on Skid Row. Our building that I showed you called the 6 is the first building that Mike Alvidrez has done off of Skid Row, because Skid Row is now too expensive for him to buy a building to house people in, and it's full. People are, downtown LA now, if you want to live there, the rents are really high, there's a lack of supply. So this is his first building off of Skid Row. And one thing that I've sort of thought about for the last several years is that when you look at other countries do not let people sleep on the sidewalk. They would see somebody sleeping on the sidewalk and say, "Why are you sleeping on the sidewalk? Come inside my house." And it's a cultural thing for us. And so we need to really fight against that and make sure that we don't normalize things that are just really something that we shouldn't let happen. But this idea that we don't have very many housing types for people, so we're now with Airbnb we're making that illegal, right? Because are only 5 days a week. Why don't we have options for people to live on couches, or to, in LA, we have what's called an accessory dwelling unit, where people who live in R1 single family neighborhoods are allowed to build a second unit on their parcel. This is R1 neighborhoods where for a long time it was, no, you can't touch that area. And the city of LA is thinking about paying people to house homeless people in their accessory dwelling units. So the city would pay people to house homeless people in these units. So we have to start thinking about more creative models. And in LA, we're set up as silos. It might be different in San Francisco, but we have a LAUSD, which is our public school system. We have the fire department. We have the building department, and they're all silos and they don't talk to each other. So we have schools that are underpopulated by students. So a school where no one sends their kids there for whatever reason, with acres and acres of land that could be park space, with a big fence around the whole thing, no housing on it either. So we have teachers who need housing, and we need to think about models where we would incorporate housing with a school, workforce housing, and that goes back to policy. So I actually like to see architects graduate from architecture school and go into other related disciplines to help solve some of these problems, because I think the education of an architect is such that you are creative and you're able to solve these problems, and so it makes more sense to have some of you go do things like that. I sent my resume to mayors when I graduated from SCIARC because I wanted to work for a city and try to solve some of these intractable problems, and 3 of them sent letters back saying, "Angie, your resume is great, we love your work, it's very interesting, but sorry, we don't have a position for you." So it took me another 15 years to co-found this nonprofit to try to solve some of those issues, but I think now people are talking about being a lot more interdisciplinary, and I think our education is changing as well, but I'd like to see more creative people in positions of power to actually make these changes.
Well, this is part of our interdisciplinary studio of architects and planners doing, the same work. So thank you for raising the interdisciplinary nature. Tamika, do you have thoughts about?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we've kind of evolved in this issue, right, of like, what is the right a mixture of humans that should live together, right? And we talk about that in cities, we talk about it in rural communities, right? And I think the work that I've done in public housing, I think is a really good example where for a long time, there was a question about concentrated poverty and what that actually did for communities and whether or not the best practice is really mixed income housing where you in fact have, where you have your neighbor, if I'm a formerly homeless mom, my neighbor is a teacher and my neighbor might be an electrician, and being able to really see a path, first of all, see people who look like you. I think this is another sort of underlying challenge that we have. Folks who are experiencing homelessness are disproportionately people of color, and that feeds into a whole nother set of dynamics in terms of our housing policy, in terms of systemic racism and implicit biases. And so there's a lot of those underlying factors that I think we have to stay very aware of, because even in the families that we serve, so 4% of the population of San Francisco is African American, and 53% of the families that we serve are African American. 42% are Latino and Hispanic. So it's a really, there's something there that we need to stay aware of when we're talking about community integration, because it matters. If you feel comfortable living next to your neighbor who speaks your language, who is an immigrant, who is worried about their kids because they're being suspended at school because in fact their behavior is a problem, but that's because the social emotional impacts of homelessness and trauma actually are showing up in school, but you're a mom who doesn't know that because nobody's telling you that. They're just telling you your kid is bad. And so there's a lot of these human dynamics that we don't get a chance to unpack because we have to try to scale. We have to try to find, typologies that actually house the most people. And so I think that there is an approach around mixed income housing and providing economic ladders within, even in permanent supportive housing. Community Housing Partnership is doing an initiative, the Move On initiative, which is providing people who have lived in permanent supportive housing, which for some is like the last stop. You need, on-site supportive services, you're not likely to have competitive wages, but those folks are actually able to start to potentially move into a different type of housing with a subsidy through Section 8. And so now those units will become available for folks who have a higher need. And so I do think there's a challenge around folks being comfortable with integrating homeless folks into their communities. But there's a schizophrenic disconnect of also then seeing the same folks on the street and being vexed that they don't have a place to live. So I think we have to resolve some of our progressive values that we should help, but then when our opportunities come to help, we resist them.
Right, great. Any other comments on this, Brad?
A couple.
Or David?
I think the aspirational notion of a kind of a mixed income or mixed tenure or however you want to describe it has always been important to me. I always saw that, and it takes some interesting physical responses. Like we build these gorgeous community rooms, for example, and whatever income you might be making, you walk into this building and this is really nice, and in your mind you're like, this is part of my lifestyle. But interestingly, very few people actually use those spaces. But it becomes this aspirational thing. And we see people move in, and the first thing they do is they throw out their old couch, and they're kind of doing their own, climbing the ladder, if you will, in their own world, whatever place they started at. And I think that goes for mixing, as I said, our evolution as a company and understanding, as it turns out, having, folks that are mentally ill, as long as they are getting services in a mixed population, has not been an issue. Our toughest population that we've dealt with are transition-age youth, because they don't have any life experience they have less life experience to sort of deal with this becoming independent. and things have settled down in the buildings where we're working with these kids, but it is a real, and I know there's groups that have proposed a lot of housing for this TAY population, and I'm going to ask you some serious questions later about that, because they really are a challenge. I know what I was like at 18, and I grew up in a family that was relatively intact. You know, imagine coming from, you know, bouncing around through that system. So I think in terms of solutions, we talked a little bit about it, but I think it's multi-pronged. I think it is ADUs. I think it's mixed income. It's targeting veterans, because as I've understood, and we're working on this issue ourselves, you know, they actually do better together. They're helping each other. Outside of their formal therapy or other sessions they might be having, they're getting together and sharing their own experiences, and they all know what the other guy's been through. Mm-hmm. They're going up on your roof deck, and they're having their own counseling session, only they don't think of it that way, and it's actually one of the more powerful ways it's helping them come back. Heard about a building in San Diego where they had a bunch of vets, and these guys took ownership of the building to the point where they were actually providing security to the very difficult homeless population that was right outside on the street. Very powerful thing. You think you're bringing a population in that you're going to spend a lot of money on services. You're not really sure if that service budget you have is going to cover it. And then the guys turned out to be stand-up guys who understand a mission. And in this case, their mission was, we have housing. This is powerful. We're going to protect it and save the owners money. I mean, these are anecdotes that I've been hearing from people in our business. So we're going to keep pushing within the system. This is one of the biggest challenges we have. I have board members that challenge us on cost, on approach, on all these other things. We're trying to move policy where we can, but at the meantime, we have to work within the system. And it's really thick with David's rules of his unit as an example, but we live under multiple contradicting rules. Just the definition of homelessness can create weeks of debate amongst agencies. I'm not kidding. This is a real thing that we struggle with. So we're going to keep pounding within the system, and then hopefully with the help of the Turner Center and other organizations, start to move policy at the state level. My last comment is about acceptance. Weirdly, we're at a point now where it seems like politicians, especially in Sacramento, are actually ahead of the population. They want housing. They want to promote policy that will break a lot of the rules that are constraining us, and yet we have a hard time finding neighbors to accept these projects. Look at what's happening in Orange County. Yeah. Cities, you know, fighting against court orders to actually do things. And it happens on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis with us. I had a conversation just the other day with a home builder. They were totally fine that we were building a couple of affordable housing projects within a planned community. But when I disclosed to them,
that's progress from 20-some.
That is, but
5 years ago.
And here's the next level of battle that we're in. I disclosed. I said, well, we don't know yet. We may have a homeless set aside. We may have, a set aside population of transition age youth or others. They were fine with the affordable, but they wanted to drill really deep into, what do you mean you're going to bring veterans in? Are they going to sit on the stoop and smoke cigarettes and cause my buyers to move on to another place? So it's happening on a lot of fronts, but I would suggest if you can actually house someone on your couch, David, as Tamika had suggested, that's the ultimate sacrifice. If you can do something personally or put them in your ADU in your backyard, that's a powerful message as well.
Yeah, I think that the diversity is sort of, though it has its challenges, it's almost always better than non-diversity. And the thing that always amazes me is how really wealthy people can be so much unhappier and so crabby and so unaccepting. And you think, wow, why you got your BMW, you got your great house, you got your great yard, and you don't want to see a homeless, a senior building. And there's that whole thing of, well, we're going to propose senior because people will accept seniors because they don't drive and they don't sit outside and smoke or something. I don't know. So they're not 18. Yeah. So anyway, I think that's moving in the direction. Though I think we are super constrained with this kind of web regulations, a lot of which is the whole notion of regulatory capture, which the boomer generation has captured the equity, and we are not letting it go. And a lot of this problem comes from the selfishness of the boomer generation. Even in San Francisco, out there in Forest Hills, there was a whole group of people that they were violently and wildly opposed to church-based senior affordable housing, and they actually killed the project in San Francisco, which is just amazing to me. And they were, there was absolute unification that this was a terrible, terrible thing to build. And it wasn't inside their enclave. It was kind of their backyards faced it. So maybe we could make wealthy neighborhoods illegal and other pipe dreams.
I think it also goes, yeah, I like that. I think it goes back to scale as well. So looking at all the student projects and kind of the density of it and the amount of land being used is great, and we always fight against that. And so in LA, we find ourselves doing smaller infill projects. So when you're only doing a 21 unit project, it's hard to get much diversity. So the big, but it goes back to policy because, for instance, in Santa Monica, if you build 50 units or less and it's 100% affordable housing, you do not have to go through discretionary review. So the policies directly force the executive directors of the nonprofits to build a certain way. So until we to me, I think, if somebody's gonna come in and build, and you can pick what percentage you want, 50% below 50% area median income, whatever it is, you can do it by right, anywhere you want in the city, as long as it meets design review or whatever, let's just make it by right. Why can't we do that? But there's no political will in LA right now.
There's no political will so far in the state of California, but if I could just make my own commercial here, which is on some of these approval issues. I was on the radio this morning on NPR saying that it's like a civil rights issue. At some point, when you have the kind of emergency that we have, we cannot, as a society, allow a small group of local people to have this self-determinism that keeps everybody else out or prevents society from solving the issues at a grander scale. So sometimes you have to seek the higher, greater good, and I for one think that you have to get to a regional or a state level on some of these kinds of policy issues. I know we're running out of time, and I could keep talking to all of you for quite a while, but I want to try to end on a question that started with David and Daniel and I on the roof of a project that we, in front of the students, an argument that we were having, a discussion on costs. And some of the students may remember this because all of you have talked eloquently, the architects and Brad in this case, about the importance of design and the floor-to-ceiling windows and the amount of, open space and the people's connection to the quality of the design. And yet, we are at a place where projects are costing $600,000 and $700,000 per unit to produce in the Bay Area, more in some cases, which is also just not sustainable. And certainly we are taking subsidy sources and not using them efficiently if we are, those precious subsidy sources, if we're spending that much money. Now, I am going to be clear in saying this question. Some of that money is land, some of that money is fees, some of that money is all this processing time. It's not all in the design, some of it's parking. So talk to us, talk to the students about how you minimize costs while designing, a human building that is going to get to all the good things that you want to get to. Are there solutions to that? And David, you talked about industrialized construction, but just talk about how we do this well from a design standpoint.
Well, I think that what happens, and I think the HUD projects of the 70s was a great example where it was very engineering driven, and they just stripped everything out. They stripped the balconies out. You couldn't do sloped roofs.
It's called cost containment.
Cost containment. And all those projects are, either massively renovated or gone at this point because they were not something that people felt love for. And so there's this issue with, you have all these things and the costs are, there are a million factors in the cost, and the difference between a good building and an awful building is a tiny bit. And a lot of times there was some stupid thing buried in there that the ugly, the terrible building actually costs more because, there's a big cantilever you can't see.
Good design can cost less.
Yeah. So.
I'm sorry, Angie, I didn't hear that.
Good design can cost less.
So, it's a good example is the housing people in San Francisco who've eliminated balconies. And, it's kind of like, wow, this is going to represent like 1/10 of 1%. We figured it out. It was literally of the cost of the building, but it was the visible piece. And that's exactly why they took all the goodness out of HUD projects, because they didn't want people complaining about wasting money on big windows or sloped roofs or balconies.
Yeah, there's a value to good design. And, I wish people would stop talking to architects about cost, because I think when you look at the whole project, I've seen costs increase over the last 30 years, and it's not because we are making more expensive wood studs. It's because we have lawyers who look at every single thing, teams of lawyers. We have a housing department that has to review everything the building department does, exactly the same thing. They go through the project when we're done and make their own check. All of these other kind of inconsequential, as far as I'm concerned,
there's like 10,000
things, there's so much of it and so many, but when you get down to what we do, we make all of our units stack. We don't do any structural gymnastics because we don't want to use any steel. There are like 5 things that we always do. And from my point of view, we haven't done modular construction because our parcels are so tiny, like 50 by 120. That's what the step up on Second was. They're like little, so I can't do modular construction, but if you're doing 300 units, it does make sense. But I really think people need to start talking about the value of design. And I can just tell one short story, which is that there was one project in my neighborhood, which is Mar Vista, really wealthy people. They came to the community meeting, and this was another nonprofit developer. He wanted to build a really nice, kind of this style building for, I think it was senior housing. They basically made him do a 2-story building instead of a 3-story building, or 3 stories instead of 4 stories, so he didn't build as many units. He ended up building the thing. 5 years later, I go to the same community meeting for my project, and someone stands up and says, "We're really sorry that we didn't allow that last developer to build what he wanted to build, because this is a great asset to our community architecturally. There's no problems with the people who live here. We thought there were going to be all these problems." And it was voted unanimously, approved. It was a little 21-unit project that I showed you. So, I think it's an intangible design, but people are constantly limiting us on both the policy side and just all these loads of regulation.
And is it codes? Or are there codes requirements?
Are some of it.
So everything is going to the direction of increasing cost.
I could spend hours talking about it. We have in LA, for instance, the code says if you build if you put your open space on the roof, and in LA you're required to have a lot of open space per unit because we have no parks. So they require each separate developer to put their more open space. If your open space is on the roof, then that is considered a story, which kicks you into a higher type of construction, which increases the cost. If I'm going to do type 3, I want to go taller. Well, you can't go taller because you have a height limit. So you're being forced to spend more money to build a building that should not cost that much based on somebody who works for the fire department who thinks something that only in LA needs to occur, which has nothing to do with life safety for all of us kind of globally.
That's a great example. That's a great example.
But there's a lot of well-meaning regulations.
Yeah, I wanted to just talk about costs from a macro level, what you first said, which is this is a civil rights question. Mm-hmm. And if we're really talking about costs, then we're talking about how, for example, the mortgage interest deduction is a subsidy. We don't use that language because subsidy only equates to poor people of color primarily, but it's a subsidy for homeowners. And so in some of the research you all have done at the Turner Center that demonstrates that if in fact housing was a right, as Matthew Desmond and some of the other folks really talk about, and you reposition those dollars through HUD, even the ones we got now, you know, because we only got 5 left. It's like $1 left. And now the man want to charge the poor people more money for the rent. I mean, I'm just saying, but even if we took those $5 and repositioned them, certainly on a project by project, there's always sort of thinking about costs. But I also think the macro question about how are we bringing more resources to bear, bringing more housing supply to bear to grow the pie and actually have a civil rights response to the fact that we have disproportionately locked people out of having housing as a option. I mean, what the hell? I mean, sorry, it's crazy town. So I just feel like design and individual projects are critical, and there's a macro question here around cost and how we use our resources.
Great, thank you. I think that's a great note to end on, if we could thank our panelists here.